Europe, 1944. The continent lay in ruins. Cities smoldered under relentless bombardment, their skeletal remains silhouetted against a gray, smoke-filled sky. Streets that once hummed with life were now silent except for the distant echo of artillery fire and the low, despairing moans of those who had survived. Millions of civilians wandered aimlessly, clutching what little they could salvage from the ashes of their homes. The war had not only torn buildings apart, it had shredded the very fabric of humanity. Across the shattered plains and forests, the German army had carved a path of domination and terror. Mechanized divisions rolled relentlessly through towns, leaving in their wake a trail of fear, destruction, and uncertainty. Soldiers advanced with grim efficiency, yet even they carried in their hearts the exhaustion and despair born of years of unending combat. For them, surrender often felt like a fleeting hope, almost unthinkable. To be captured meant the promise of harsh treatment, starvation, or worse. A fact whispered in fear along the lines of the Eastern Front and the snow-covered trenches of Normandy. And yet, across the ocean, an entirely different reality awaited, a world that many of these soldiers could scarcely imagine. America, untouched by the physical devastation of European cities, seemed almost a utopia by contrast. Rolling fields stretched beyond the horizon, dotted with farmhouses and barns, where the air smelled of fresh earth and growing crops instead of smoke and gunpowder. Here, war had arrived only as distant news on radios or in newspapers, its horrors abstract and distant. This is where the story takes an extraordinary turn. Imagine for a moment a soldier hardened by years of brutality, accustomed to witnessing death and cruelty at every turn. Now imagine him stepping off a transport truck onto the soil of a small American town. He expects cages, malnutrition, guards barking commands, perhaps even violence, but instead, he is met with something utterly different. A warm handshake, a plate of freshly cooked food, and a human smile. It seems almost impossible. The contrast is staggering. On one side, the relentless inhumanity of war, and on the other, an unexpected tenderness that feels almost alien. These German prisoners of war, men who had survived the most harrowing battles of World War II, were about to discover a truth that would shatter their expectations. In a place they expected only confinement and cruelty, they found generosity. In a moment designed to break them, they were met with nourishment, kindness, and an almost disarming civility. The lesson hidden in this encounter is profound. The most important data is often the one you cannot see. It is easy to assume the world will treat you as you have treated others, especially in the shadow of war. Yet here was evidence that human decency could persist even in times of chaos. What follows is not just a story of survival, it is a study of the human spirit, of strategy and psychology, and of a moral calculus that defies expectation. As we begin this journey, prepare to witness a paradox. Soldiers hardened by conflict discovering the power of simple human kindness, and how that kindness, served on a plate of steak and potatoes, left an indelible mark on those who thought they had seen the worst of humanity. The journey across the Atlantic was as much a psychological trial as a physical one. Packed into transport ships, the German prisoners of war stared at the endless gray expanse of water, each wave a reminder of how far they were from home, and how little control they had over their fate. Rumors filled the air like the salty spray off the decks, tales of harsh camps, guards who took pleasure in humiliation, and rations so meager that hunger would gnaw at them day and night. For these soldiers, fear was a constant companion. The Atlantic, vast and indifferent, seemed almost to mirror the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Many recalled the stories of captured soldiers who never returned, or who returned broken, both in body and spirit. Every creak of the ship, every shouted command, every clanging chain added to the mounting tension. Their imagination, sharpened by years of combat and survival under impossible conditions, conjured horrors that sometimes outpaced reality. As the days stretched into nights, the prisoners clung to routine, to whatever small certainties they could find in an otherwise uncontrollable journey. Conversations were hushed, sometimes anxious about the worst-case scenarios. Some feared the cruelty of guards. Others, the relentless monotony of captivity. They had been trained to anticipate danger on the battlefield, but nothing in the European theater could have prepared them for the psychological weight of this voyage. Yet amid this sea of fear and expectation, there was a quiet, almost imperceptible undercurrent of curiosity. What was this land across the ocean? How would its people view them? Would they meet the same brutality they had experienced in the war's most infamous prisons, or dare they hope something different? Every moment was a tightrope between dread and anticipation, a suspense that tightened like a vice with each passing hour. And then, finally, the horizon broke. The first glimpses of the American coast. For many, it was a surreal sight. Rolling hills, forests, and the tidy structures of small towns, standing in stark contrast to the bombed-out ruins of Europe. The soldiers could hardly reconcile what they saw with the stories that had filled their minds for months, years even. The stage was set for a revelation that would defy everything they had been taught to expect. In this new world, the rules were different. The cruelty they anticipated, the hunger they feared, the humiliation they prepared for, all of it was about to collide with a reality that was startling in its unexpected generosity. This was a moment suspended in time, where the past and the future met on the deck of a ship, and where the first seeds of disbelief, and eventually gratitude, were quietly planted. These men, shaped by conflict and conditioned for survival, were on the cusp of discovering that sometimes, the greatest surprise comes not from the enemy, but from humanity itself. Across the ocean, life in rural America was a battlefield of a different kind. The war had pulled young men from the heart of these communities, leaving fields unplowed, barns unpainted, and harvests at risk of rotting under the summer sun. Families worked tirelessly to fill the gap, their hands calloused from long hours, their bodies aching from relentless labor. Yet no amount of determination could fully replace the sons, brothers, and fathers who had gone to fight in distant lands. In small towns, the rhythm of life was measured by the seasons, the rising and setting sun, and the demands of the soil. Crops that once fed communities and armies now teetered on the edge of waste. Corn threatened to wither in the fields. Wheat lay golden but untended, vulnerable to storms and pests. Every day was a race against time, against nature, and against the quiet but mounting despair that grew alongside the weeds. And then came an unlikely solution. German prisoners of war, captured on European battlefields and shipped thousands of miles across the ocean. Initially, the idea seemed almost absurd. Could men who had once fought against America's sons now work alongside them to save the nation's harvest? Could those trained for war become instruments of life rather than destruction? The paradox was striking. These soldiers, whose presence might have once sparked fear, were now positioned as partners, albeit under guard, to sustain the very backbone of American sustenance. They were trained in discipline, endurance, and obedience, traits that would prove invaluable in the fields. And yet, their transformation from enemies to unexpected allies was not instantaneous. Suspicion lingered, tension lingered, and every interaction carried the weight of history and the shadow of conflict. For the farmers, it was a delicate balance of pragmatism and humanity. They were facing a crisis, and necessity demanded solutions that tested their own moral compass. Feeding, housing, and supervising men who had once been considered threats required courage, patience, and an unusual empathy. Slowly, the prisoners became part of the rhythm of rural life, their hands tilling soil that once nourished enemy soldiers, their labor bridging a divide that had seemed insurmountable. This moment is emblematic of a truth often overlooked. Survival and productivity in times of crisis are not merely about strength or numbers. They are about ingenuity, moral imagination, and the willingness to see beyond the obvious. The American farmer's front line was not marked by bullets or bombs, but by judgment calls, ethical calculations, and the quiet, unglamorous work of keeping life and hope alive. In this unlikely convergence, enemies became collaborators, suspicion yielded to necessity, and the moral fabric of humanity was quietly tested, not in the theaters of war, but in the fertile soil of America's heartland. The long, exhausting journey across the Atlantic had left the German prisoners weary, wary, and wary of every expectation. Years of war had conditioned them to anticipate the worst: hunger, humiliation, and cold, impersonal confinement. Every command barked by guards, every step taken in line, reminded them of the countless horrors they had endured and inflicted. And yet nothing could have prepared them for the moment they entered the mess hall at Camp Crossville. Rows of tables gleamed under warm, inviting lights, the air rich with the aroma of roasted meat, baked potatoes, and fresh bread. The scene was almost surreal, a space meticulously arranged for comfort rather than intimidation. And then, before them, plates were set with steak, golden potatoes, vegetables glistening with butter, and the unmistakable promise of abundance. It was a stark contrast to the meager rations they had grown accustomed to in the European theater. Thin soups, hard bread, and the constant gnawing emptiness that defined survival on the front lines. As the prisoners hesitated, forks trembling slightly in their hands, a quiet shock rippled through the room. They had braced themselves for deprivation, for punishment, for the indignity of scarcity. Instead, they found nourishment offered freely, without conditions, without malice. Every bite was a revelation. The food was not merely sustenance, it was a symbol, a quiet assertion that dignity need not be stripped even in captivity. Some soldiers exchanged wary glances, as if searching for the hidden trap, the angle that would justify their suspicion. But there was none. No guard sneered, no officer mocked. The meal was served with calm professionalism, but also with a subtle warmth that defied expectation. The POWs, hardened by years of brutality, discovered a sensation almost foreign to them: relief and, surprisingly, gratitude. The psychological impact of this simple act cannot be overstated. A meal, basic, human, and honest, became a catalyst for reflection. These men, trained to see only threat, cruelty, and strategy, were now confronted with evidence that the world could still operate on principles of generosity and care. The lesson was profound. The quality of treatment often carries more weight than the force behind it, and small gestures of humanity can recalibrate even the most battle-hardened psyche. In the hours that followed, conversations around the table were subdued, contemplative. Men who had been enemies, who had witnessed atrocities and committed them, found themselves confronted with a paradox. They were captives, yet treated with a respect that rivaled, and often exceeded, what they had experienced from their own military. The steak and potatoes were more than food. They were an education in decency, a subtle but powerful strategy that reshaped perceptions, built trust, and laid the foundation for cooperation. In that mess hall, amidst the clatter of dishes and the soft murmur of hesitant conversation, the POWs realized that survival in this strange, new world was not defined solely by endurance, but by the quiet power of generosity. They were beginning to understand that sometimes the most important forces in history and in life are not guns, bombs, or strategy, but the unseen currents of empathy, respect, and shared humanity. The first meal had left the German prisoners stunned, but their minds were not yet at ease. Years of war had honed their instincts for danger. Generosity from an enemy was rarely, if ever, genuine. In their experience, kindness was a strategy to lower defenses, to entrap or to humiliate. Every polite gesture from the American guards and farmers was met with quiet skepticism, every warm smile examined as if it hid a secret motive. The days that followed only deepened this tension. Meals continued to arrive, hearty and abundant. Beds were clean, medical care attentive, and work assignments purposeful rather than punitive. Slowly, the prisoners began to notice the rhythm of humane treatment, an order that felt deliberate yet without malice. At first, it was bewildering. Could this really be the enemy? Could men trained to kill and destroy also act with consistent care toward those they had once considered irredeemable foes? Gradually, suspicion gave way to curiosity. Soldiers began to watch and listen, trying to understand the logic behind this unprecedented generosity. They observed the farmers in the fields, the quiet efficiency of guards who maintained order without cruelty, and the subtle gestures of goodwill that pervaded camp life. There was no hidden trap, no sudden punishment, only the steady, almost disarming demonstration that humanity could persist even in the shadow of global conflict. This curiosity sparked reflection. The prisoners began to compare their current experience with memories from European battlefields, the harsh rations, the freezing barracks, the constant suspicion and betrayal. And yet, here in America, the rules were different. The very idea that an enemy could offer sustenance, respect, and dignity challenged the core assumptions that had guided their survival for years. With time, gratitude quietly emerged, tentative, cautious, but unmistakable. Soldiers spoke softly among themselves, sharing amazement at the contrast between expectation and reality. Each meal, each kind word, each thoughtful gesture chipped away at the armor of cynicism that had been essential to surviving war. They began to see a world where kindness was not a weakness, but a form of strength, capable of transforming fear into cooperation and tension into mutual respect. The paradox was profound. In the midst of global violence and suffering, an enemy could act with decency, and that decency could shift the mindset of hardened soldiers. The lesson was as unsettling as it was enlightening. Human behavior is never entirely predictable, and the most important forces often remain invisible until they are experienced. For these men, curiosity became the bridge between fear and understanding, a bridge built not with weapons but with the quiet, persistent power of empathy. The first morning in the fields was quiet, tense, and almost surreal. Men who had spent years trained to wield rifles, to calculate the trajectories of artillery, and to navigate the chaos of battle, now found themselves gripping plows and hoes instead. The soil beneath their hands was the same earth that had nourished generations of Americans, yet in this moment it became the unlikely bridge between former enemies. Awkwardness dominated those early days. Language barriers made even the simplest instructions a challenge. American farmers gestured broadly, shouting words that only partially registered, while the German prisoners nodded hesitantly, unsure if they understood, and unsure if they could trust. There were moments of silence so heavy it felt tangible, punctuated only by the rhythmic scrape of metal against earth, and the occasional cough or grunt of effort. Each man was acutely aware of the paradox. They were enemies, yet they were being asked to collaborate for a common goal. Slowly, through the repetitive labor of planting, tending, and harvesting, the tension began to ease. Shared effort created its own language, a nod of acknowledgement, the passing of a tool, the synchronized rhythm of hands working the soil. These small, silent gestures began to replace suspicion with recognition. The prisoners observed the farmers' skill, their intimate knowledge of the land, and their unwavering commitment despite the hardships of wartime shortages. Respect, quiet and mutual, began to grow in the furrows of the fields. For the American farmers, the change was equally profound. They witnessed men once trained to kill demonstrate focus, discipline, and endurance. Slowly, the barriers of fear and resentment softened. Where suspicion had dominated, practicality and necessity forged a new dynamic. These German soldiers, once instruments of destruction, had become co-laborers in a vital mission, sustaining the very communities whose sons were fighting overseas. By midweek, patterns of efficiency emerged. Tasks were completed more swiftly, teamwork improved, and even laughter, hesitant and low at first, began to punctuate the workday. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Hands that had once held rifles now moved with purpose across fields of wheat, corn, and vegetables. The tools of war had been exchanged for tools of life, and in doing so, both captors and captives discovered a shared humanity that neither had anticipated. This period of adaptation underscored a timeless lesson. The most difficult obstacles are often not technical, but psychological. Fear, mistrust, and preconceived notions can only be overcome through experience, patience, and shared purpose. The POWs and farmers discovered that productivity and collaboration can flourish even in the most unlikely circumstances. Through labor, they built more than crops. They built bridges across the gulf of war, proving that transformation is possible when necessity meets empathy. In the fertile fields of America, the extraordinary became ordinary, enemies working side by side, learning from each other, and discovering that the soil beneath their feet was richer than any weapon they had ever carried. Evenings at Camp Crossville carried a quiet intimacy that contrasted sharply with the day's labor. As the sun dipped behind the rolling hills, the mess hall transformed from a place of sustenance into a space of human connection. Here, over shared meals of meat, vegetables, and bread, stories began to emerge. Fragments of lives that had once seemed distant or even unknowable. The German prisoners, still cautious, began to speak in hushed tones about home. A soldier described the cobblestone streets of his village, the scent of fresh bread baking in the morning, the laughter of siblings in the courtyard. Another spoke of family farms tucked into hillsides, of fathers who had taught them to work with their hands, not just to survive but to create and nurture. Each story, simple and heartfelt, revealed a life shaped not by ideology, but by ordinary human experience. On the other side of the table, American farmers listened with rapt attention. They had imagined the enemy as a monolith of cruelty, conditioned by propaganda and the narratives of war. And yet here were young men whose fears, hopes, and longings mirrored their own. They laughed at familiar anecdotes, nodded at shared struggles, and occasionally offered advice or encouragement. The prisoners were discovering that Americans were not the monsters portrayed in wartime leaflets, just as the farmers realized their captives were not hardened villains, but ordinary young men swept into circumstances far beyond their control. Letters began to arrive at the camp, and with them, glimpses into the emotional worlds of both prisoners and farmers. Homesickness surfaced as a common thread, a longing for the comfort of familiar streets, the touch of a mother's hand, the sound of a sister's voice. Conversation shifted seamlessly from the practicalities of farming to the deeper questions of life, family, and what it meant to endure. The walls between us and them gradually began to crumble, replaced by curiosity that deepened into empathy. These evenings became a subtle experiment in human psychology, the juxtaposition of expectation and reality, the deliberate slowing down of daily routines to accommodate reflection and dialogue. The POWs learned that trust could be nurtured not through coercion, but through consistent kindness. The Americans discovered that empathy could flourish even in the context of captivity. Together, they began to understand a timeless truth, that human connection, once established, can transcend even the deepest divides of ideology, nationality, or circumstance. By the end of each night, as the mess hall emptied and the men returned to their bunks, a quiet transformation was evident. The psychological armor forged on battlefields thousands of miles away softened. Suspicion gave way to understanding. Curiosity had matured into empathy, a bridge extending between hearts that had once been defined by fear and the rigid expectations of war. In these shared stories, over simple meals and flickering lamplight, history was being rewritten, not by generals or politicians, but by ordinary humans discovering that even in times of conflict, connection, respect, and compassion can thrive. It was in these moments that the invisible, enduring power of kindness became tangible, leaving impressions far more lasting than any weapon ever could. War teaches a simple, brutal lesson: cruelty is easy and hatred is convenient. Yet in the fields and mess halls of rural America, a different lesson was unfolding, one that challenged the very assumptions the German prisoners had carried across the Atlantic. Here, captives were not met with punishment, but with respect. They were fed abundantly, treated with decency, and entrusted with responsibility. Why? What strategic or moral principle could justify such behavior in a world defined by conflict? The answer lies at the intersection of morality, psychology, and strategy. America's approach to its prisoners reflected a recognition that kindness is not weakness, it is a force multiplier. When hunger, fear, and resentment dominate human behavior, they consume energy, erode cooperation, and create chaos. By addressing these basic needs and preserving dignity, the Americans reduced tension, fostered productivity, and transformed potential adversaries into contributors. In the language of strategy, generosity became an instrument of control, quiet, invisible, yet profoundly effective. This strategy was not devoid of ethical foundation. It reflected values deeply embedded in human civilization. The belief that even in times of conflict, people retain the capacity for decency, that mercy can coexist with duty, that treating others as human, even when they are enemies, can yield outcomes far beyond brute force. The POW's skepticism slowly unraveled as they experienced this truth firsthand. That empathy, patience, and consistency could achieve what fear and punishment never could. Philosophically, this moment exposes a timeless principle. The most powerful forces in human interaction are often unseen. Respect and mercy operate beneath the surface, shaping perception, loyalty, and behavior long after a specific encounter has ended. The Americans at Camp Crossville were not only cultivating laborers, they were modeling a moral intelligence that would leave a lasting impression on those who lived under it. Soldiers who had known only suspicion and violence were confronted with a subtle but transformative truth. The unseen power of mercy can alter hearts and minds in ways that weapons never can. In the fields, at the tables, and in the quiet routines of daily life, the prisoners were learning lessons that went far beyond survival. They were discovering that the calculus of war is not solely measured in victories and defeats, but in the choices we make when we hold the power to punish, and yet choose to act with humanity. It is a lesson that resonates not just in history, but in life itself. Often, the most consequential forces are those we cannot see, and the most enduring victories are achieved through dignity, respect, and unseen compassion. The war eventually ended, but for many German prisoners of war, the experience at Camp Crossville had etched memories that would last a lifetime. When they returned to Germany, they did not bring back tales of captivity, fear, or humiliation. the narratives that might have been expected. Instead, they carried stories of meals served with kindness, work done with dignity, and a humanity that defied the grim logic of battle. These were not trivial memories. They were experiences that challenged long-held assumptions, reshaping how these men perceived not just their former enemies, but the very idea of human decency. Back home, conversations that once might have centered on military exploits or losses were now interspersed with reflections on simple acts of generosity. Soldiers described the first bite of steak and potatoes, the warmth of a clean bed, the patience of American farmers who had taught them to till the soil. These accounts often seemed almost fantastical to fellow Germans, yet they were repeated with sincerity. In communities ravaged by war, where suspicion and resentment could easily take root, these stories planted seeds of reconsideration, of curiosity about the world beyond immediate conflict. The broader impact of these memories was profound. By sharing what they had experienced, the returning POWs softened perceptions of America among families, neighbors, and even local officials. In a time when propaganda and wartime rhetoric had painted the enemy as monstrous and irredeemable, first-hand testimony provided a counter-narrative. The men became inadvertent ambassadors of a different truth, that compassion and decency could exist even in the midst of global violence, and that bridges between former adversaries were possible when human dignity was preserved. This transformation underscores a powerful paradox. Weapons destroy, but meals and the care behind them rebuild. While battles claimed lives and left scars on cities and landscapes, it was quiet acts of generosity that repaired hearts, shifted perceptions, and laid the groundwork for reconciliation. The prisoners' internal transformation, shaped by repeated exposure to kindness and trust, highlighted a truth often overlooked in historical accounts. Conflict does not solely define human experience. The responses to it do, and sometimes the smallest gestures carry the largest consequences. As the POWs reintegrated into German society, many carried these lessons beyond personal memory. They influenced friends, family, and eventually broader cultural understanding. Their stories contributed, in small but significant ways, to post-war reconciliation, demonstrating that humanity can endure, even thrive, when approached with empathy. What these soldiers learned was timeless. While destruction may be immediate and visible, the constructive forces of respect, care, and generosity operate subtly, quietly, and often invisibly, yet they leave a legacy far richer than any battlefield victory. In this way, the journey of POWs at Camp Crossville becomes more than a historical footnote. It is a study in the unseen power of kindness, the enduring impact of empathy, and the truth that even in a world defined by conflict, bridges of humanity can be built, one act at a time. The story of German prisoners of war at Camp Crossville does not end with the final harvest or the last meal shared in the mess hall. It lingers, quietly but profoundly, as a testament to the invisible forces that shape human history. Here, in the unassuming fields of rural America, soldiers hardened by years of combat discovered a truth that no weapon could teach. Kindness, dignity, and empathy carry a power far greater than destruction. A plate of steak and potatoes may seem trivial, a simple, everyday meal, but for men conditioned to anticipate cruelty, it became revolutionary. It was more than nourishment. It was a demonstration that even in the midst of global conflict, the human spirit could remain intact. The POW's astonishment reflected a lesson that transcended time and geography, that compassion is not a weakness, but a strategy, and that generosity can cultivate loyalty, trust, and resilience far more effectively than force or intimidation. History is often written in headlines of battles, treaties, and conquests. Yet the quieter, subtler currents, those small acts of humanity, often wield the most enduring influence. The soldiers who labored in the fields, shared stories over supper, and experienced unexpected mercy became witnesses to a different form of power, one that reshapes hearts rather than borders, that repairs trust rather than destroying it, that fosters cooperation rather than sowing division. These lessons, carried home across the Atlantic, quietly influenced perceptions, softened animosities, and contributed to the long, slow work of post-war reconciliation. There is a timeless lesson here, one that applies far beyond the borders of a single conflict. In moments of tension, fear, and uncertainty, it is often the smallest gestures that leave the deepest mark. A meal, a word of encouragement, a patient hand guiding unfamiliar labor. These are the acts that ripple outward, touching lives in ways that violence never can. The POW's astonishment reminds us that even in darkness, compassion illuminates possibilities, offering a path toward understanding, connection, and peace. As the years passed, the legacy of Camp Crossville persisted, not in monuments or medals, but in memory, testimony, and reflection. It serves as a reminder that the strategies of war, while visible and immediate, are not always the most consequential. True power, the power that endures, lies in empathy, in moral courage, and in the conscious choice to treat others with dignity, even when circumstances would justify the opposite. So when we reflect on the past, let us remember the lessons carried by those who once expected only cruelty and instead found generosity. Let us recognize that history is shaped not only by armies, battles, and borders, but by the quiet, unseen choices that define our shared humanity. And perhaps most importantly, let us carry forward a universal truth: kindness, like a humble plate of steak and potatoes, may be simple, but it is among the most strategic and transformative forces in the world.